Hello, and welcome to the Alternate History Class podcast. My name's Andrew, and here I explore alternate history through the lens of a history class from another timeline. Last time, we looked at the motivations behind the Great War and what each nation wanted. This week, we'll look at how the American front developed on the international side and take a quick look at how Europe unfolded in a very similar way. All right, let's dive into the Great War. Now, when it comes to the Great War, the U.S. had been planning for a war of this type for a long time. They knew that eventually they would get their opportunity for revenge on the Confederacy. So they had been making plans for years, and the plan that they had ready to go at the time was the Custer-Carpenter Plan, named after General George Armstrong Custer, a longtime general in the U.S. Army, and Admiral Charles C. Carpenter. Now, this was originally the Custer Plan because it focused mainly on what the Army would do. It assumed that in any war with the Confederacy, Britain would get involved on the Confederacy side. And so the U.S. would have to fight a two-front war. But assumed that the Confederacy would mobilize slowly. So the U.S. would quickly strike at Canada, knock them and effectively Great Britain out of the war in North America. And then after capturing Canada, they would put their full weight on the Confederacy. What Admiral Carpenter contributed was the Navy would have a key role in blockading the North Atlantic and the Gulf of Mexico to cut the Confederacy off from any potential allies that it would have, to cut their resources, to starve them out, to end the war quicker. Because the U.S. was not going to make the assumption that this would be easy because they had gotten knocked flat on their faces in the War of Secession. Now, when the war first broke out in North America, as you should remember from last time, the Confederacy did not join the war for about a week after the U.S. So the U.S. was able to implement a form of this plan while it expected the Confederacy to join. It was able to utilize a larger portion of its army than it initially expected to strike quickly against Canada in the east, pushing them back to the St. Lawrence River and capturing the Maritimes within 2 weeks, and capturing key western cities, the west of Canada, of course, being much more lowly populated, key cities, though, such as Vancouver and Winnipeg, within 3 weeks. But, as we said, the Confederacy joined in, and within 1 week of that. But the U.S. had already been mobilized and going. So they were able to do a quick strike attack that captured Maryland in the portion of D.C. that is north of the Potomac, as well as establish bridgeheads over the Ohio in Kentucky, basically capturing the northern coast of the state. But after about a month of fighting, the lines really solidified along the Potomac, in portions of western Virginia, along the West Virginian border, in northern Kentucky, but west of the Mississippi there was not much activity. So the borders were basically along the country borders there. And this devolved into trench warfare, as defensive weaponry had long outpaced offensive technology when it came to the military. And so it became a major victory if you could move forward and capture 100 yards in a single day. If you could move multiple miles, you were moving at a breakneck pace in this war. It was a long, arduous fight that the citizens of both nations really didn't want to happen. The citizens themselves were expecting a quick victory. Now, this wasn't just something isolated to North America. This was something that was common across the board. The Confederacy thought it would just teach the U.S. a quick lesson. Germany and France each thought they could knock the other out quickly. Britain thought them jumping in would quickly end this war and everyone would get to be home by Christmas of 1914. Now, that obviously didn't happen. The war not ending until the December armistice in 1917. This fighting was absolutely brutal beyond what anyone had seen in other wars. That was largely due to advancements in technology. There were flamethrowers. First use here, some very preliminary versions of flamethrowers. There were machine guns, which had been used in smaller wars before, but this was the first real breakout, so to speak, of machine guns, and the first time they had really been used in North America in any real capacity, making lots of the old tactics that involved a lot of charging at the enemy lines. Very, very costly. One of the ways they tried to break up with some other new weapons, such as gas weapons, using mustard and chlorine gas that would poison the enemy, would cripple their soldiers, and would make it easier for your soldiers to advance. These kinds of gas canisters were, of course, depending on the wind. You fired it and the wind changed. The gas, which was heavier than air, could easily just flow back on your own men. So gas masks became an essential starting gear for all soldiers in the war. And this would be the first war where airplanes played a major factor. Now, they started off as just scouts, but everyone who flew one of these scout planes was given a sidearm in case something happened and their plane went down and they got caught behind enemy lines. They could have the opportunity to fight their way back. They'd have the ability to. But neither side wanted their enemy scouts to, get the information that they needed about the enemy's positions and troop movements and the such. So pistols were commonly used during the beginning of the war. Pilots would kind of just fly by each other and shoot at each other. They were very inaccurate, as you could imagine, flying a plane and trying to shoot a handgun, especially one of those older planes that doesn't have any autopilot or anything. This would evolve into planes with guns on them, guns that were put in a place to shoot around the propellers. There was technology then invented to allow the gun to shoot from behind the propeller. And there were planes invented for 2 seats where you would have an additional gunner to shoot at the enemy. There also was another use that was found for planes during this war, and that was as bomb delivery systems. The first instances of this were pilots taking grenades with them and chucking them and dropping them out of their planes at soldiers who would shoot at the planes to try to bring them down. Not a very effective method, as the planes were often out of range for even the most accurate sharpshooter to land an effective hit. But then they were given larger grenades. They were given bombs to drop from their planes, and eventually planes were invented that would drop bombs, very rudimentary things that would evolve later on to be much more sophisticated. But bombers were also invented. At sea, the major advancement was a invention that the Germans had been working on, and after the war started, shared with their American allies, of the underwater boats, or as we here in the U.S. call them, submarines. Now, submarines were largely used to mess with shipping, especially in this early war, but could also use their torpedoes and stealth to attack unsuspecting battleships. These battleships were the mainstay, the grand prides of any navy, and so countermeasures were quickly developed, depth charges, very rudimentary ones. So you had to drop at just the right time, and you had to be very quiet to listen for a submarine with sonar, radar, radio technology. But probably the thing that came out of this that would be the most effective in future wars were barrels. Now, barrels were invented to try to break up this stalemate. Barbed wire was often laid out in the no man's land in front of enemy trenches, so that the enemy couldn't just quickly sneak across. They had to be very careful or very deliberate, or they would intentionally hurt themselves, carve up their legs. It was there as a deterrent, and once you got to a trench, you tended to have to dive down into them, into very brutal hand-to-hand combat. As is usually the case, no one wants to get killed in war. They want to kill the other person. The British tried deploying barrels, which they called tanks, relatively late in the war. But when they were first really utilized in the war in 1916, they were used to support infantry. Barrels were used mostly as mobile artillery, more than anything else, and understandably so. Most had a cannon that they would shoot. But there were those who saw the usefulness of the tactics of them. And that included one Colonel Dean M. Giffelin, who, with the permission of the head of the U.S. Army and the commander of the U.S. Army in Kentucky, John J. Pershing, decided to group up the tanks that they had and attack as a tank unit, the first real tank units. And they did this in the Third Battle of Frankfurt. This tactic was extremely effective, especially against infantry, which is what tended to be in the trenches. It broke the backs of the Confederate troops defending Frankfurt and allowed the first real major breakthrough of the war. Now, these tactics that the Gilfian and Pershing used were directly against the orders of those in the War Department. And if they had failed, could have gotten them court-martialed and at worst executed for defying direct orders. But this would make April 6, 1917 an extremely important day, because this quickly became the tactic that the U.S. and their allies would use to break the stalemates across the board, and would eventually be the major factor that led to the armistice. Matter of fact, within 2 months, the U.S. had made such strong advancements, capturing all of Kentucky, capturing large parts of Western Virginia and Northern Virginia, and even deciding to make pushes across the Mississippi in Texas and Sequoia, that the Confederate government called for an armistice by mid-July. Now, in Europe, things played out relatively similarly. The Germans had their own Schlieffen Plan, which had assumed the Russians would be bogged down in their mobilizations due to the size of their nation. But that obviously ended up getting thrown out the window because the Russians were ready a lot sooner than the Germans expected. Now, that kind of plan may sound similar to others because it was the Custer-Carpenter plan. The Custer-Carpenter plan was based off of the plan, but the Germans ended up getting bogged down, not just by Russian mobilization, but Belgium refusing to let them through and putting up a strong, unexpected defense. Now, we're not going to go into deep depth of what went on between the European powers in the war. But one thing that we will touch on next week when we look at the home fronts for the North American nations was uprisings. So we'll touch on them quickly here. The Germans decided that one of Britain's greatest advantages was the size of their empire, but it was also one of their greatest weaknesses. So they funded uprisings of the Boers in South Africa, as well as the Irish, who had been on the verge of rebelling before the war started. And now with promises and funds from the Germans and the America, and when the U.S. was able to gain an advantage in the North Atlantic against the British Navy, the Americans would help ship the guns. These two fronts would divert troops away, but it still wouldn't make that big of a difference until 1917, when everything just kind of fell apart. It started with the Russian revolutions, the first revolution, the March Revolution, where the Tsar was forced to step down and the Duma took control, and then the beginning of the October Revolution, which the Bolsheviks ousted their political opponents from power in much of Western Russia, and decided to sign a quick and brutal peace offer with the Germans, as their primary goal was to get out of the war, as it had been what the Russian people had wanted due to the extremely poor handling of the war by the Russian Tsar. This was paired with a breakout in the West. Not only were the Germans, after the Eastern Front was closed up, moved to the West, not only were those troops going to make a major difference just in manpower and in fresh boots on the ground, but they were going to be a big morale boost for their counterparts. The Germans really utilized the U.S. barrel tactics only 20 days after their allies, when they made a second attack at Verdun on April 26th and broke through using the grouping tactics that the U.S. had in Kentucky. This would lead to the French troops mutinying only a week later, on May 3rd, when they refused to go and fight the Germans anymore. They directly revolted, and many of these soldiers just deciding to head to Paris to stop the government from the bloodshed as they saw it, caused the French government to be overthrown, and the new government not wanting to have what happened in Russia the previous year happen to them, immediately requested an armistice with the Germans. The UK would be soon to follow, as now they had no real continental allies left. This armistice would take place on December 12th of 1917, which is why December 12th is still a great day of remembrance in many nations around the world. Because now this bloody war was finally going to come to a stop. And the treaty was going to be hashed out. Now, before we go home, I realized I never talked about the Italian front. That's honestly because there's not much to note there. In Italy, the Italians just kept throwing their troops at the Austro-Hungarians over and over again. And constantly lost hundreds of thousands of men. It's honestly a shock that the Italians never mutinied against their commanders, but they were a young nation, they were a hungry nation. And so perhaps that's one of the things that held them together, that with the Balkan front closing up very quickly as well after Bulgaria entered the war and sealed Serbia's fate. The Austro-Hungarians, despite all their incompetence, were able to use machine guns to shoot at Italians, and even they could use barrel tactics to break through the exhausted Italian lines and force them to armistice by the December 12th deadline. Next week, we will dive into what exactly happened on the home front, because as some of you may know, what we discussed today was not all the fighting that was going on in the nations. And as I said, there would be uprisings in North America. So we'll talk about those next time.